Well, thank you, Ed, and thank you to the Stockdale Center. Appreciate the invitation. It's great to be back. I really miss y'all, so it's nice. Look, I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, so I'm just going to jump right in and talk about this forthcoming book that I co-authored with Dean Peter Baker, who's at the University of New South Wales, and David Wedham, who's at King's College London. The ethics of special ops. Why this book and why now? Really, I think this book is mostly Dean's brainchild. My Australian counterpart. He was getting ready to give a presentation at Australia's version of SOCOM, and so he decided he'd prepare himself, in advance, and he went out to say, okay, what are the ethics of special operations? Let me just sort of familiarize myself with it. And he found nothing, or essentially nothing. There really was nothing out there that's focused on this. The field of military ethics has done a respectable job of keeping up with modernity. There are volumes that have been written about artificial intelligence and cyber and remotely piloted vehicles and all this other stuff. So lots of things have been written. Yet we've largely ignored one trend. All right. Hey, what's going on? So the fire marshal may have a problem, but I'm okay. All right. This is like theater in the round. Okay. All right. Are we basically good? Okay, this is great. Thank you for being here. Yeah, come closer. This is cool. Okay, so what I was saying is we have largely ignored, I think, one important trend, and that is the increasing reliance of states on their special operations forces. And we believe that this is a trend that's going to continue. It's going to become increasingly difficult for great powers to compete as peers on the battlefield. But they're still going to try to find some way to, we are going to try to find some way to hurt each other. And we're going to try to find that way just below that threshold that would potentially bring on major war, which we can't tolerate. And so SOF is going to play a very important role in the so-called gray zone. Why now? So I think that the primary answer to that question is, kind of read the newspapers. There have been quite a few cases of ethical failures in special operations. And it seems to be somewhat universal. So we represent Australia, the US, and the UK, and there have been a number of ethical failures in each of our countries, which suggests there may be something about special operations, or maybe special operators that make special operations uniquely difficult and challenging from an ethical perspective. More importantly, at least for me, Australia, UK, and US SOF have been at war, since 9/11 plus a couple hours, and there may be SOF outside the wire as we speak. We have been fighting for generations. SOF has been fighting for a generation length of time. We owe them something. We owe them more than just the ability to, to fight and win. We owe them all the tools that they can have to fight and win, but also come back with honor, come back as full human beings. Okay, so we organized this book according to the subtitle there, Raids, Recoveries, Reconnaissance, and Rebels, mostly just because we like alliterations are cool in book titles. But I'll go ahead and organize my discussion like that as well, though we don't really need to, but we'll do that anyway. Okay, we'll start with raids. Now, a raid is, there's nothing specifically SOF-oriented about raids. And, all ground forces conduct raids, air forces conduct raids. Raids is something you do. You're going someplace where your adversary feels reasonably safe and confident. You use speed and surprise to get into that space. You're typically going to break something or kill somebody or capture somebody, and then you're going to get out. So that's a raid. Everybody does it. There are, however, several reasons why a military commander or a political leader would turn to SOF for this. And I think two really stand out for me. The first is what one author calls certain access. And I'd never heard that term, but I like that term. I think that speaks volumes. SOF will find a way of getting into a place that conventional forces might not be able to. And my favorite example of this, and when I was in Egypt one time, I went to pay homage to this place. It's Alexandria Harbor in World War II. That's where the British fleet was. And the Germans and the Italians were trying their best to infiltrate that, or to destroy those ships, to sink those ships in harbor with all their conventional means. It's conventional forces against conventional forces, and they weren't successful. And what ended up succeeding was this whole certain access thing. 6 Italian frogmen riding manned torpedos infiltrated the harbor, put them on, and they actually came up at the end and said, Buongiorno, we've got a bomb on your ship. And another thing I really enjoyed about that, the Italians, I work with their SEALs a lot. They do everything with such style. But before they enter the harbor, so they're sitting on top of their little torpedoes, bobbing around outside. And before they enter the harbor, they pour glasses of wine. They split a bottle of wine, toast the victory, and they go, okay. I've had a little wine. I'm ready to die. Let's go. Okay, so so certain access. The second one is political sensitivity. Now, not all special operations are politically sensitive, but the fact that some are, that's kind of why SOF exists, because some of those are. And special operations offers states this ability to achieve potentially even strategic level objectives without signaling, a new national commitment. So at a fairly low price, low visibility, they're able to maybe, and not always, but maybe sometimes achieve some strategic level objectives. So there's two, and we had more in this book, but I want to be careful about time. Two primary ways in which SOF raids can challenge the laws of armed conflict and certainly the just war conventions. The first is a tension that exists between disguise and deception on one hand and perfidy on the other. So achieving certain access again, this often necessitates some form of disguise, some form of deception. So pretending to be something or someone that you're not. And this is unproblematic. It's perfectly legitimate most of the time anyway, to disguise yourself as a tree. In fact, I see several trees in here now. So nothing morally problematic about that. But there are limits that SOF down to the lowest levels have to understand this line where you can't cross, where legitimate disguise and deception becomes perfidy. it becomes perfidious when your disguise or your deception puts at risk an institution that everyone on the battlefield has cause to want to preserve, friends and foe. So for instance, we want to preserve the institution of surrender. So if you engage someone after waving the white flag to bring them in close, that is perfidious, because it damages the institution of surrender. We want to be able to do that. We want our enemy definitely to feel that they can surrender safely. Non-combatant immunity is an institution we want to preserve. So when we go into the fight, we wear usually some kind of uniform, but if not, you have your weapons in the open so that you can be identified as a combatant. The second ethical friction point is the tension between targeted killing and assassination. So I mentioned that raids often involve killing somebody. But very often with a soft raid, it's not about killing just any adversary. It's about killing a specific adversary, a dude who's got a name that you know. And I don't know, isn't that just assassination? Aren't we just participating in assassination? In short, no. It's not assassination, and it's important to recognize the distinction. There's this fundamental idea in warfare that soldiers fight other soldiers. They don't fight individual people. Having said that, when there is a specific person that we can identify by name, if that specific person poses an imminent or ongoing threat, then game on. That person is fair game, and that's targeted killing. So it's okay to find, fix, and finish, Bob the bomb maker, or Mary the terrorist leader. Where this starts getting fuzzy is when that person is primarily a political leader. It seems kind of counterintuitive, right? So right now the Ukrainian army can wipe out entire formations of Russian conscripts mostly, good to go, and yet Ukrainian SOF, both by law and by norm, can't go in and assassinate Putin, even though it kind of seems like a world without Putin might be desirable. At the heart of this assassination ban is the idea that it's both ethically and practically better to be able to have a legitimate leader leading your adversary who you can negotiate with and ultimately actually make peace with eventually. So you actually want to preserve this, which is why the assassination ban. No matter how awful that leader is, a leaderless state, there's an assumption that that's probably worse, and it probably is. But of course, that difference, that's a lot of space between, killing just a named bomb maker and the head of a state. There's lots of shades of gray within there, and that's again why the ethical friction. Okay, so discrimination is, this is a basic idea in the jus in bello tradition, right? You got to discriminate between combatant and non-combatant. For recoveries, and we're thinking primarily in this chapter about hostage rescue missions, the combatant is the mission, right? If you fail to discriminate and you kill the hostage, you failed your mission, And it's very likely going to also end up into some sort of national disgrace, because these are usually fairly high visibility. Because of this, the special mission units that are tasked with this mission set, with the hostage rescue mission set, they spend countless hours on the ranges and run innumerable and complex kill house scenarios, so that when the real thing comes, they can be very discriminate in their fire. And this is why this is one of those missions that really is more of a soft mission, because the conventional forces really just are not going to have the time to be able to invest in this and still do all the other tasks that general purpose forces have to do. Okay. So precision is why you turn to soft. Some of the ethical frictions that are involved, again, two stand out. The first one is you got this need for speed and discrimination, and those are always in tension. So as soon as an adversary knows that there is potentially a hostage rescue underway, that hostage or those hostages are at profound risk of being killed. So most of the time, SOF will move as close to the target as possible, as close to the hostage as possible before they go hot. But once they go hot, it's a race to get to those hostages. Now, when you're racing to get to the hostage, it is common, actually, for teams to encounter non-combatants. Dealing with non-combatants takes time. Killing them wouldn't. So as you're racing to the target, killing a non-combatant is your fastest way of getting there. Okay, and I think everybody recognizes that there's no real gray areas. That's just committing murder, right? You can't do that. You can't kill non-combatants intentionally. But here's where there may be a gray area. What if instead of a non-combatant, you have somebody who was a combatant, throws down his rifle and says, "I surrender"? So once again, we have an obligation, because once somebody surrenders, they are hors de combat. They're out of the fight. So they become non-combatants, and you owe them everything you owe to a non-combatant. But here again, there may be, is there some reason to suspect the possibility of perfidy of a terrorist, of a hostage taker, say an explosive vest? And for that reason, I think that maybe engaging them violently would in fact be at least morally defensible. And I think that the same sort of, with the bin Laden raid, we see the same kind of thing. The second ethical friction associated with hostage rescue is really the decision to launch a hostage rescue mission at all. Unlike most states, the U.S. has a no concessions policy. We don't negotiate with terrorists. Why not? Hostage rescue is really dangerous. It's dangerous for the hostages. It's dangerous for the hostage rescuers. So why not pay them off, pay the ransom, and then go head hunting later when the hostage isn't there? And I think the answer is grounded in the assumption that if we can make taking American hostages not a lucrative enterprise, then fewer American hostages will be taken. So that's all on the good side. On the bad side, I can think about three things. For one thing, I don't think there's any real data that supports that. For another, man, that's a really bad day for the American hostage. Anytime you get taken hostage, you're never gonna come home, or you're going to be you have to be concerned about maybe getting killed in a crossfire. And finally, this policy basically shifts the burden of negotiating with hostages and paying hostages or hostage takers to the families. because families typically don't have this policy, and there's ways of going around. So you've essentially shifted the burden, and this happens anyway. So anyway, it's something to think about. Okay, reconnaissance operations. So again, military forces do this all the time. There's nothing soft specific about this. The primary difference between a special reconnaissance operation and reconnaissance that's conducted by conventional forces usually is the risk. And that risk comes primarily from being far flung from friendly forces. So if you get in trouble on a special reconnaissance mission, help's a long way away, and in fact, it may never come. And so that's where you turn to SOF for reconnaissance. And that leads to that idea of isolation leads to the key ethical friction point, and that's the soft compromise. And we saw that dramatized. Anybody ever see the movie Lone Survivor or read the book? Yeah, so that was a soft compromise. And there's another excellent book, Bravo 20, talks about a UK SAS element, a reconnaissance element that had the same sort of thing. And you can see there's real temptation to kill the goat herds in the lone survivor case, because they knew correctly that if they let them go, there could be trouble. That's just, again, that can never be made right morally. It's completely indefensible to kill, and even, so some people will claim, and I think maybe with some validity, that, well, they are reconnaissance elements, essentially. And I think that's about right. I'm a goat herd and a recon element. But even if they had, think about if they are fully armed and they all had, I love Osama bin Laden, tattooed on their forehead, then you could kill them, right? No. When is it proper, when is it okay to kill somebody in your control? So essentially never. Okay, last one, rebels. Two things that make SOF particularly useful when working with partner nations. The first one is just cultural competence. Now, SEALs we do this mission, like sorta. The real pros are Army Special Forces. They're awesome. And I've seen them at work. And it's not just that they have the language and know the cultures. They're kind of trained more generally. They can fit into just about any culture. They can drop in and fit into any culture. They're really superb that way. The second thing that makes somebody want to turn to SOF is that SOF is trained to operate either clandestinely, covertly, or just with low visibility. So again, you can do this work, you can do this labor with a guerrilla force or with a partner nation, and it'll be fairly low vis. Okay, the ethical friction points. Really, it comes down to an asymmetry between sponsor and proxy. Okay, so and that, I think I could break that up into a couple things. The first one is the asymmetry in the war aims. So, war aims are never perfectly aligned, but they better be close. Because if they're not, and the powerful state sort of says, yep, I'm cool, I've achieved my war aims, that powerful state can just leave the proxies high and dry. And by the way, that's exactly what we saw with the U.S. government and the Kurds in 2019. And then what's, I think, particularly pernicious about that is that often that proxy force would have never even chosen that path. They would have never even gone, okay, I'm going to try a military option to do whatever it is they're trying to achieve, other than the fact that this powerful sponsor is there behind me. That's actually the definition of moral hazard. You take on more risk than you otherwise would because you think you got your back covered. The second asymmetry is an ethical, an asymmetry in the commitment to ethical warfighting, the commitment to the laws of armed conflict. Some guerrilla forces probably don't, they didn't do any 203. They probably don't have the same commitment. And that puts some very junior special operators into some very difficult situations. You're trying to earn the trust and confidence of maybe a tough, weathered guerrilla fighter, but there are certain lines you cannot cross, and they may. Okay. So most of what I've talked about has to do with the Jus in Bello Convention. I think I'm going to try to buzz through this one in a couple minutes so I can have some time for questions. So I can have when that hits 4, right? I'm done. Is it okay? All right. I'll buzz through this pretty quickly, but I want to give you a sense for this because I think this is an interesting part of the book. But we turn at the end to the Jus ad bellum convention, and we try to look at the tensions between what we're calling strategic special operations and Jus ad bellum. Strategic special operations, I don't think that's a doctrinal term. We kind of made it up, and that's how we defined it. So those standalone missions. So in 1976, Israeli commandos violated the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Uganda, killing 45 Ugandans and in a hostage rescue mission. Or the U.S. in 2011 violated the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Pakistan and killing 5 residents, including one Osama bin Laden. The Russians, the little green men, violated the political sovereignty and territorial integrity of Crimea, took over their parliament, and miraculously the parliament votes for Russian annexation. So the question that we're asking in this chapter is, should strategic special operations be subject to the same constraints that inform our decisions to go to full-blown war? And I mean, and there's some reasons. So almost everybody recognizes these 6 criteria. There are some reasons. I mean, just cause, the bar that's set for just cause is appropriately high because war opens up the gates of hell. Well, I mean, killing 2 Ukrainians doesn't sound like the gates of hell. So maybe the bar is set too high. I already talked about misalignment of war aims. Having a legitimate authority publicly declaring that we're coming, using SOF as a last resort, that's not really what SOF does. SOF works because we're not expected. If they're on their toes, it doesn't work as well. It seems like this is an easy A, proportionality for strategic special operations. But we also have to think about escalation. What are the chances that this steps over their tipping point? And we don't control that. That is something that we don't control. And can you really judge success of a mission without really knowing the cost, without really knowing whether or not your adversary is going to up the ante and go ahead and escalate. A guy named Michael Walzer, political theorist, he believes that it's time that we have a new jus in bello, jus ad bellum, but also a jus ad vim, and vim just means for the use of force. And one of the key elements of this is he believes that if you're talking about just using force, it's got to be more permissive. There's a great debate that's going on about whether, we should do that. There's a group that really focuses on this, or there's a couple of scholars that really focus on this. and primarily look at this idea of escalation. That should be a separate criterion. There's a Helen Frau, another philosopher. She believes that actually the question of escalation is contained by any good analysis of proportionality, and so it's already there. We said we weren't, hey, we didn't want to come in with this is what we believe. A couple of our readers said that's, don't be a coward, say something. So we did. We actually sided with Helen Frau with the no, that we think that the Jus ad bellum convention is sufficient to do this. And I think mostly what lent me in this direction was the idea that a Jus ad vim convention could potentially lead to more bloodshed and more death and destruction that wouldn't necessarily be ethical. The last thing I want to say before I turn it over, if I were to summarize this book, I would just say, a sentence or two. There is something about the nature of special operations and special operators that do press up against and challenge our ideas of military ethics and all that stuff you learned in NE 203. But these criteria are robust. And these criteria are flexible. So we think that they are fully capable of encompassing strategic special operations and special operations in general. And furthermore, given the degree of difficulty of special operations, it's not enough that our special operators have a casual relationship to this. And I would say that you come out of NE 203 with a casual relationship with the ethics of war. I think as with other things SOF does, they need to be the masters of it. I hope you have some questions. Yes?
Sir, I feel like it's somewhat easy to put these ethics on special operations while we're at the Naval Academy in a normal room. But if special operators are in the field conducting operations at a time other than war, or even at full-scale war, do you think though that we can actually expect them to follow this code of ethics without bringing that warfare to the stage of full-scale war?
So fighting ethically and full-scale war are not opposed things. You can bring it on. I mean, again, all the just war criteria that we look at, all of the moral factors that you think about in NE 203, they do not prevent you from bringing it on. What they do prevent you from doing is crossing that very thin and permeable membrane between being a murderer and being a killer, and being a warrior, and that's important. So mission accomplishment is really important. Coming back with a pulse is really important, but I think we also have the obligation to have our troops come back as whole human beings, and not. I know you've talked about moral injury in NE 203. This is a real thing, and by the way, I mean this comes from. I've been working on this my whole career. I think my very first time in combat, I came this close to killing about a dozen women and children. And it all would have been legal, but if I had been able to think about this beforehand, that would not have happened. If that did happen, I was saved by luck almost. If that did happen, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. Does that get to where you're asking?
Yes, sir.
Good. Lauren.
So is this book more for people who are going to use special operating forces, or is this book more for the special operators themselves?
So all of the above, and also people who are going to think about it. So we made it so that scholars we tried to make it so that scholars will find it interesting, practitioners will find it useful, and people who are just interested in special operations maybe, they'll read it and they will be hoping for a lot of blood and guts, and they'll be getting, ethics. It's like, oh, damn, that's philosophy. Woo. Yes?
Sir, is there ever a time where a special operations team should sacrifice some of their ethics and morality in order to prevent a full-scale war in which tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people may die?
So that would be more up to, so that's the type of question that leaders would ask, that political leaders would ask. So in the book, I said, what if Putin, when he sent his little green men, what if he recognized that war was inevitable and he cannot lose that port at Sevastopol, right? Yeah. Okay, could not lose that port. And I think he's right. And they're about to become NATO, maybe? I can't have my Black Sea Fleet so he sees this war coming. So I made this argument that maybe that was a preventive war, which is not considered a just cause for war, but maybe in this case you do it. And that's how just cause should be thought of, I think, is, these are layered ideas. It's not a checklist. Consequences can outstrip principles. Generally speaking, they won't. Of course, that's not what Putin had other things in mind that are just awful. So, but yeah, I think it's there, but I think that's going to be such an exception that we don't really have to worry about it until maybe we're 3 stars. Yes, sir.
What would be your assessment of SOF as a whole now in terms of how familiar they are with these ethical ideas? Is it something that you feel needs to be integrated more, or is it something that's integrated at all?
Yeah. So I personally, my first rules of engagement, we'll call it ethics training. I got a 2-hour rules of engagement lecture about 2 hours before I was going to go on my first combat mission. And let me tell you, that did not sink in, and actually I remembered one thing. They told me about the the laws involving war trophies. I was like, war trophies? The only trophy I want is my ass. It's like, and my troops. I was worried about all those things. So back in the day, and I came home and that's when I started discovering this stuff. So now, I've been out for 10 years. We had a very good ethics program. I ran the center, I ran BUDS at the end. We had a really good ethics program. I think that persists. I will tell you though, at least at my day, it was not being backed up, I think, sufficiently across the street by the no kidding SEAL teams who were really stinking busy. But I think I tell you, they are really interested. They are really, and I know that they've come a long way since I left. I left in 2010, and there was clearly a recognition at the top levels of Naval Special Warfare, actually of U.S. SOCOM in general, and also, by golly, the Australians are all over this. There's a recognition of this need. So in those 10 years, I would surmise that we've come a long, long way from when I got a 2-hour ROE brief right before I went in for my first combat. Mm-hmm. All right.
If you don't have class, Dr. Herbert will stick around and answer questions individually. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Roger, for being here.
Yeah, that was fun.